and cybersecurity hygiene today. So the first portion of the class today is information classification. Why is it essential and how it can inform the tool selection when you're looking for a tool to work with when it comes to your research at UBC. Just like Rachel mentioned, we're going to be getting questions through Slido. You can use the QR code here on the page, or just go to slido.com and use the code that's on there to connect to the session if you want to ask a question. I invite, of course, those in the room. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We're happy to take question live as well. And our agenda for that first portion here, we're going to talk a little bit about specific use case. I'm going to ask the audience, including those online, to just let us know a little bit about what kind of research you do or you're planning to do. And then we're going to be taking notes and sort of try to use examples that are closer to what you're working with at the moment in your research. We're going to talk about information classification, what it is, what it means, how to use it at UBC. And then we're going to talk about what are the data sharing tools, what are the kind of tools that you can use that are already compliant with the university, or if they're not, what you should look for. So for that first question, maybe I'll just ask if someone wants to, either in the room or online, if you want to put it in the chat, just raise your hand and just let us know what kind of research you do, what kind of information you're working with. Yes. Okay, yeah. DNA sequencing, okay. Awesome. Do we have some people from the chat? Yeah, I should be able to see it here. Chat. Awesome. So I have health research, genomics. Okay, so we're in the same sort of range. I think that's going to be good for us for the examples. Okay, so in terms of UBC, as you know, UBC is a big university, and we have research that spans from everything from social studies to genomics data and everything health, and just sort of everything in between. So how does it work in terms of information classification? How does one classify their data at UBC? Here's where we're going to get into it. So first off, I want to start to why is it important to do it? Well, first thing is, like I was saying, we have so many things happening at UBC and so many research in different fields that it's important that we have different kinds of classification to make sure that the proper security controls are applied to the data that we're working with as researchers. And also, of course, tools are not created equally. What it means is like no one solution that you're going to be using will have the same security controls by default. For example, if you're working with health imaging or health data, the solutions that you're going to use, the vendor might have already meet certain number of criteria or have certain controls already in place to protect the solution. It's not always the case, but usually fits with whatever their niche is. And on the other end, you might be working in a different field where security controls are not as important. Security has an associated cost as researchers. As you know, you usually work with either grant money or restricted budget or no budget in some cases. And the security controls you're going to put in place, sometimes they might be costly. They might have an associated cost, especially if you need some staff to deploy and maintain it. And that's why classifying your data is really important, because it allows you to, first of all, know what kind of control, how much it's going to cost you, but also it allows you to figure out where to put your data so it's placed in a way that it generates the least amount of cost for your research. Just to give you an example here of what it means, we use the example of your home versus a bank. They don't need the same level of security. If you take your home, you usually have security, which is like your door is locked. You might have an alarm, you might have cameras, and you have valuables that you store in your home, but it's your home. Compared to a bank, you expect a different level of security. In a bank, you usually have security guards, you have a vault, you have different kind of things that you would not necessarily have in your home. So it just depends on, it all comes down to what is your data and what you're doing with it and how valuable it is to you. And of course, compliance, which we'll talk about later, is mandatory when it comes to UBC. There are the security requirements, and we're going to talk about it. And classifying your data is a requirement at UBC. So to classify information, it is a three-step process, which is relatively simple. The first step is identifying your information. So what kind of data are you working with? Does it involve consent? Is it data that you've collected from, say, StatScan, or is it something that comes from a repository that you might be taking? Is it secondary use data? Is it data that you're going to be collecting from participants from a form, and it's going to be interview, whatever? So just keep that in mind, because this is information you need to know. What kind of element are you going to be working with? Is it going to be personal? Is it going to be medical imaging? Is it going to be genomics? Is it going to be information that's collected from a form for your behavioral research? And do these elements fit the purpose of your research as well? So what's important when we talk about data collection and research, especially if it involves human, you want to make sure that you collect only the information that's necessary for your research. You don't want to go anywhere beyond. So you don't want to have too much stuff. You don't want to have too little, because you still want to do your research, but you don't want to have too much. Does it involve humans? If it involves humans, is your data de-identified? And if it is de-identified, how? And what is the de-identification process? What is the data linkage process? Do you use a master cross sheet where you have all your participant personal information, and your research data participants will have participant number? If it's the case, then where's that cross sheet stored? Is it stored in the same system? Is it in a different system? How is it protected compared to your research data that's already de-identified? And then proprietary information is also something you want to consider. If you're working with proprietary information, it needs to be protected at a higher level than, say, if it's public information, obviously, but also it might be subject to requirements such as contracts or terms of service, or if you work with a partner, the partner might have requirements. And lastly, when you identify your data, you want to think about the entire life cycle of your research. So don't just think about, oh, when we collect the data, it's going to be this. That's your raw data. But you have to think about, okay, once it's processed, what does it look like? Once we're done with the processing and we're at the point where we want to write our paper, what does data look like? Once we're ready to deposit it and for long-term archival, what does it look like? What kind of classification can we put on these level data? Step 2. To do this is to essentially have a look at the UBC Information Security Standard U1 is the standard that essentially has all the details about how to classify your data. The QR code here brings you to that second link, UBC Research Information Classification. It is the same as standard U1. It's just we, on our website, we have put some examples that are more research specific, because the standard U1 is more like institution level. So it talks a lot about student information and stuff like that. In our case, it's more research specific. I'll just leave it here for a sec for those who want to take the QR. Good. So the step 2 is to go and consult this. I'm going to show you what it looks like in just a few slides here, what the categories are like and what kind of example we have here. But that's step 2. And then step 3 is to classify your information. Remember, we've identified our information. Now we went through the chart, and we want to look at the element that we collect or store that meets the highest risk on the chart. So for example, if we're working with genomics data, medical imaging, we look at where it sits in the chart from low, medium, high, or very high risk. And whatever we hit, the highest we hit is usually our general classification for our data. Now, one thing to note is you might have multiple classification, and what it means is, like I was saying earlier, not all the systems are the same, and your data might be divided between different systems. And you might have all your more valuable or higher risk data on a system that has certain controls, but you might have other research data that's, say, de-identified, or that doesn't have, or even like your administrative stuff that doesn't necessarily mean needs the same level of control as your high-risk data, might be stored on a different system. So there might be different classification, something to keep in mind. And essentially, the systems you use or the solutions you use, they must be protected according to the data classification that your data has. So the more risk associated with your data, the more security controls you're going to need in place when it comes to compliance. Just a quick note in terms of responsibilities, because it's something that you're going to be needing to identify, is just referring to standard U1 here, is essentially the information steward or owner is responsible for the security classification. So what it means is it's usually the principal investigator in a research, or it might be a service owner, or it might be whoever is the data steward or owner. In some cases, it's data that belongs to a lab, so the lab might be responsible. If it's UBC, then UBC becomes the information steward. But essentially, as a researcher, if you're working with data, before you start doing the collection or the processing of data, just make sure that you've identified who's responsible for the information. Before I get into the example of what it looks like in standard U1, I'm just going to make a quick pause if we have questions. Is there a question in the Q&A? No, okay. Any questions in the room at this point? Perfect, okay. Okay, so this comes from the ARC website. So it's just to show you some examples of what the data classification could look like here. We're going to start with low risk. So low risk is usually essentially publicly available information. So for us, if it comes from StatScan, or if it's like something that you got in a repository that's publicly available, this is public data, and it's considered low risk because even if the data would be lost or stolen or compromised, data is already available out there, so it cannot really be stolen. One to keep in mind, at UBC, business contact of staff and faculty is considered low risk because it's not considered personal information, because this information is already usually available publicly. Medium risk information, this one is more like your proprietary information, and the thing to note is medium risk information does not involve human data, so anything that would involve human data would be classified higher, but it'll be like if you're working with proprietary research data, if you have information that needs to be protected, information that is valuable to your research and that you don't want out there before you publish your study. This will be usually medium risk information. High risk information, that's where we get into personal information involving humans. So it's usually either photos, videos. If you have behavioral research study that collect age or gender or this kind of information, this is all considered personal information. And at UBC, this is going to be classified high risk. One thing to note is, regardless that your data is de-identified or no, it'll usually be meeting high risk classification, even if it's de-identified, because it is still considered personal information. And usually when it comes to high risk information, it can also be something that if it's not personal information, you have to consider it also things like what the government of Canada considers sensitive technologies. And I invite you to have a look at UBC Research Security's website, which has has a lot of information about sensitive technology. But if you work like if you do research in technologies, something like biomedical or bioengineering stuff, this is something you might want to be familiar with. Also, high risk data, if it's not personal information, can also be something that's difficult to recollect or reproduce. So if you have data that's very valuable to your research, not necessarily personal information, but it's information that would be very difficult to get back if it gets lost or stolen, then you might want to go and classify it high risk, so you have the proper controls in place. And then finally, the highest classification UBC has is very high risk information. And that is really when it comes to, like, if you have personal health number, usually genomics data falls into that category. Imaging, if it is identified, will fall in there, but biometrics, biospecimens, SIN numbers, and all of the things that will potentially cause significant harm if they get lost or stolen. So as you can see, there's quite a few, and I wanted to just show a couple of reminders when it comes to this. Data classification, you can always go higher on the chart. What I mean by that is, like, if you feel like you want to have more protection for your data, even if it classifies medium, but you're like, I want to have the best protection, you can always classify it higher and try to meet the requirements that are higher in the controls there. And there's no, it cannot be too secure. The more controls is always better. So classification can go higher, but also keep in mind that you cannot go 6 months down the road once you collected your data and it was personal information. In 6 months, you cannot say, well, and now it's no longer personal information. It usually remains what it was at the time of collection, so you cannot go down. Keep in mind where your data comes from and how it was classified to start with. What I mean by that is, if the data is in, I'll take the example of genomics data here. In terms of genomics data, there are certain genomics data that you can obtain that are in public repositories. So is it very high risk data? Probably not, because it's already something that was de-identified and published publicly. So you have to consider a classification considering where the data comes from. Also considering what it might be classified at from the get-go. If it's data that comes from, say, StatCan, sometimes they have some of their data sets that are restricted, and they'll have a terms of service. So you have to make sure that you meet the requirements that are associated with these terms. Speaking of that, consider applicable regulation, especially if you're working with human information. I put GDPR here as an example because that's probably one that's common. If you're working with data that comes from Europe, there are a lot of requirements that are from that regulation, but in Canada, each province has their own privacy regulation, and you have to consider these also when it comes to classifying your data. Just as I was saying, if you have data sharing agreements, terms of use contracts, you want to consider that, especially when it comes to proprietary data. If you're working with a partner, there's good chances there'll be some requirements around the data and the way it's classified and protected. And lastly, if you're working with personal information, be mindful that you're working with information belonging to people, and think about how it would impact you if that kind of information would be out there. So you have to be mindful of the impact of the information you're collecting, the way you're protecting it, protect it as the same as it is your own information. Give it the care it needs, especially when it comes to people's information. And then lastly, think about the impact of your research at a global scale. What it means is, like, as researchers, we tend to say, oh, my research is not that important, right? It's just small research in a university somewhere in Canada and nobody cares. But somebody do, and we see a lot of attacks coming, especially from nation state, going across the world, and they attack different universities to steal the data from their research because it can be valuable to them. So even though you think that your research might not be valuable to what you do, think about it on a global scale and think that it might be valuable to someone else and they might want to have it. I'll make another quick pause for question before passing it on to Scott for the second part.
There's no questions.
Still none? Okay, all good here?
I think it jumped ahead too from this.
Oh.
There we go. Okay. So I'm going to carry on with this one, and we'll talk a little bit about what can happen with your data. And we're going to look at a specific thing that in cybersecurity we call the triad. It's CIA, not the American CIA, but confidentiality, integrity and availability of data. And these are sort of ways to categorize the threats associated with what you might have. So when a hack, not a favorite term of mine, would occur, a loss, a disclosure of the information, what impacts might you have based on what has occurred? And we're going to look at a couple of examples, and I'll try to maybe adjust it based on the examples that we heard of the type of data people have. Some of these are going to be fairly straightforward, and some less so. And I'll also add that when most people think about cybersecurity, the first thing that comes into their mind is the confidentiality one. And the integrity and the availability are a little different, but we'll go through all of them. And I'll explain how those go as we go through this example. So Luke mentioned very high risk data that would be something like you have a PHN number, you have a social, like these are directly identifiable. You have this one bit of information, you know exactly who that is. So in case of the confidentiality of that, if this information was disclosed, I think most people can kind of guess that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing because now you've got somebody's PHN. You can go do all kinds of things with that information. You can try to pretend to be them. You can go and find out information about their medical history that you shouldn't have access to. So that one's kind of easy to guess. But what about integrity? Integrity is when you do something that alters the data in some way, unintentionally. So the data gets changed. So let's say you're collecting this health data and you need the data to be accurate, but somehow somebody gets in there and changes it. What would be the impacts of that? And so the examples here are, you might give the wrong prescription because somebody flips a digit on the PHN and now you're thinking you're dealing with a totally different person. That's an integrity attack. Or maybe the information that you've painstakingly collected gets corrupted by a piece of malware on a computer, and now all your readings are off, right? You still have the data. It hasn't been disclosed anywhere, but it's now been rendered wrong. It's an integrity problem. And then availability is you just can't access it. So availability attacks are an interesting one, and one of the best examples of it I think most people have heard of in the news is ransomware, right? It encrypts all the data on a device. Still there. It's super secure. Nobody can access it. But it's not secure because it's an availability attack. So you've lost the ability to get at that data. It might be just for a period of time, or it might be for longer. So in this particular example, like if you had, again, health data, and you're trying to get a study done, or you're actually doing a clinical trial, and you can't access the data, this could actually have implications to patients. It could be detrimental to your research timeline, your budget, all kinds of issues associated with that availability kind of an attack. So let's look at a couple other examples, maybe less obvious ones. And this is one of my favorite ones when you're thinking about the classification of information, not just the research data. So unpublished manuscripts are information, and you should classify those as well. And until they're published, they're actually confidential. You don't want somebody having access to your whole manuscript that you've just spent 5 years working on before you publish it. Then you want everybody to have access to it. But until that point, you want to keep it confidential. So if somebody gets a hold of your stuff and they breach the confidentiality of your manuscript, now you're looking at the potential that somebody could just steal it, publish it ahead of you. And this happens quite frequently, unfortunately. People will spend a whole bunch of time, they'll get their, it'll be almost ready to go. Somebody will lift it, publish it, and now they've just lost 5 years of their life. Integrity-wise, this one might be a little bit easier to understand here. Somebody alters your manuscript and it gets out there and now there's incorrect information in it. Or they alter the data associated with a manuscript and there's incorrect information in there. Those are an integrity attack against that kind of information. And finally, availability, if you can't get to your manuscript, either to continue working on it or to publish it or get to the data that you need to finish it off, that one's also quite an obvious, this is really, really not good. So again, these are cybersecurity threats against something like a manuscript. Here's one that we get in IT, maybe not as relevant for the examples we got here, but an architecture diagram. What would be the confidentiality associated with that? If somebody externally can see exactly how your network is set up, where all your computers are, what they're named, how everything flows within your architecture, that gives them a tremendous amount of information to make it easy for them to either steal stuff, destroy stuff, get in, do bad things. That would be the confidentiality. Integrity-wise, if they change your network architecture, now you don't know how your network is set up. Similar problems. And availability when you really need to get your architecture information and it's not available to you, that's a big problem. And there's an excellent example of this. Happens strangely quite often. Somebody's got all their information about their architecture on their infrastructure, and an attacker gets in and takes out their infrastructure. Now they can't figure out how to get their infrastructure back up again because the information about how to do that is exactly what they don't have access to. And so it's an availability attack against things like their architecture diagrams, their how to reboot the server information, that sort of thing. This one's also a really interesting one. We talk to people a lot who say, well, I'm not too worried about my data. It's just synthetic. You know, I just generate it. I have a computer. It spits all this stuff out. And Luke mentioned this. Think about how hard it might be to reproduce this. So it's fine. There might not be any confidentiality exactly associated with synthetic data, but you spent a bunch of time doing it that somebody else hasn't spent. So they might want to steal that data. Maybe they want to steal it for a different purpose. Maybe you're doing synthetic data for one research project, and they're saying, I'm going to steal that and train my AI model on it or something. Or it's just incredibly expensive to get it back. Maybe you've spent the last 6 months with a supercomputer generating this stuff, and to do that again, you don't have time or budget to do it. So that getting stolen is a very big expense. It's a loss for your project. And the same is true sort of on the integrity side of that. Even if it's synthetic data, if somebody alters it and makes it useless to you, that's an integrity attack. And that could be a big problem. And availability, again, if you can't access it and you need it, that's a problem. This one's a little more interesting. I don't know, is there anybody working specifically, not with AI, like not using ChatGPT, but actually doing research associated with AI? Yeah? 2, 3, awesome. 4, okay. Everybody's going yes. Awesome. Have you done any machine learning, like fine tuning, low-ranked adaptation creation, that sort of thing? Okay. So confidentiality-wise, it's sort of similar to the synthetic data, perhaps, but it could be related if you're actually training a model on personal information. Then you have a confidentiality risk associated with that model itself. Is the model going to leak anything? Has the training been really good? And you can actually get information out that you don't want to. So that's a potential confidentiality issue. Integrity-wise, there's a couple of different things. People can poison your model. There's a lot of efforts right now online to intentionally poison AI models. So you have to be super careful of what you're sticking into it, because it might be data that you really don't want going in there. Or it could be looking at it from the other side coming out, or if it's a model that's doing classification or something like that, is it actually producing the desired output based on potentially an incorrect integrity issue associated with the model, or somebody's altered it in some way? And then availability, this one, you just need access to your model again. If they render it unavailable to you, that's a problem. Or render your data set for training unavailable to you, that's also a problem. And sometimes the availability one doesn't only mean ransomware. It could also be a denial of service attack. Somebody just slams the network storage with so many requests you can't get stuff out. It's perfectly safe, running fine there, but you can't access it. Couple more examples. Code. Code is another one that happens a lot in research, where you have proprietary code, you want to maintain its confidentiality. It could be code that would reveal sensitive information if it was released. So the confidentiality risk there can be quite high, especially if it's code you're working together with a partner. There might be agreements. We have people who are working with national defense. They don't want that code out there. The integrity of the code, obviously, if somebody changes it, and now your code doesn't work, and you don't know where in the 10,000 lines somebody made a little, or they inject something into it. That's another really common issue. Now there's malware in your code. Maybe it came from a third-party library. It's another threat against that. And availability, again, if you can't access your code, you need to rebuild it, or you need to change it or alter it or keep the next version going. That one's a little more obvious. So this is kind of an opening it up. We talked about a couple of different examples here. Does anybody have another one they'd like us to think through? Another kind of data to look at the CIA impacts associated with it? You don't have to. Anything on chat? Okay. Yeah.
If the data is going to be if the data has been de-identified for something like as abstract as like brain signals, for example, and there's no names or anything, but it's just its age and gender/sex and all of that, how is that still high risk if it's impossible to like tell?
If it's truly impossible to re-identify, then it might not be. You might be able to consider that level of de-identified data lower. The trick is that it's often very hard to really guarantee you've de-identified it completely. So whereas, like, especially if you're dealing with like MRIs, I'm assuming these are like image files or big data sets, and there's usually a bunch of metadata that comes along with it. And much of the identifiers are actually in the metadata, not in the main data. So people will strip the metadata off and go, okay, we're good. The problem is actual identifiers frequently leak into the other part as well. We see it a lot on medical imaging files where all the metadata has been stripped clean, but somebody made a note in the corner of the actual image with the person's PHN number or MRN number or something in it. And so it's usually safer whenever you're dealing with health information to, as Luke said, just classify up one. Just as an extra precaution. But another one to think about, it's really interesting, is what would it look like if the data was exposed on the front page of the newspaper? And it's a good way to think about it. So the news article is 10,000 brain scan records from a UBC research project leak online. Nobody cares at that point if they're de-identified or not, because it just looks bad. So the reputational damage can sometimes be another reason to bump up that classification, even though it's de-identified. Now, where it gets tricky is when you need to use certain tools or share the information with other people, and you need the classification to be a little lower in order to make that all work. And that's where one of the things that we can do, and I'm sure it'll say it in here coming up, you can always come and talk to us, and we can help walk through the specific example, use case, and systems involved to help figure out exactly what the best way forward might be.
Thank you. Thank
Sure.
you so much.
Okay, I'll plot ahead. Tools. That was a very good segue. So Information Security Standard U3, and you'll hear us talk about security standards a lot. We have that kind of weird illness where we actually like reading policy documents. I know most people don't, but it's something, it's our day-to-day life, so forgive us. But the information in there is designed to support these kind of questions. So as you need them and as you need to find those answers, think about jumping over to the standards. And I will toot UBC's horn a little bit. We have some of the best information security standards in the country, published in the most intuitive way. So when you go to them on the website, if you actually hover over a term and it's a defined term, a pop-up will show up telling you what that term means. Very few other places that have that kind of level of information. So they're quite easy to read, even if they're daunting policy documents. So U3 covers tools and sharing of UBC electronic information. And I'll walk through basically what's in that standard in a nutshell, but you can also, there's a lot of more information in the standard than just this one table. So this talks about, based on my classification, which is what you see across the top, low risk, well, very high risk through low risk, what kind of tools can I use? And the first one is just email accounts that are UBC email accounts, not your Gmail, not your personal email, actual UBC ones. And in general, that's perfect for low risk information, obviously. You can use it for medium and high, but you shouldn't do that if you're going to be transmitting stuff regularly. Like if you're transmitting about a proprietary research project and the email actually contains the proprietary data, and you're going to do that twice a day on an automatic system, email is not your friend. It's not a great way to be sharing that kind of information. There's better ways. So you can use encrypted attachments, but I would suggest in general, modern day stuff, sharing information over email is not great in general. It's certainly not very efficient. And when it's very high risk information, you have to put it in an encrypted attachment, which is a lot of extra work. So it's really not a great choice. The main reason we don't like email for this sort of thing is because there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. You can misaddress the email. The wrong person can see what's in the email. It gets stored through other systems, and in a lot of cases ends up as plain text somewhere along the line. So emails can bounce from one server to the next server to the next server. And as it does that, it might get completely exposed on a particular server somewhere before it gets to its final destination. So it's not a great solution. Personal email accounts, forwarding your email to Gmail or something like that, it's not permitted at all for anything medium risk and above, and not recommended for low risk. And in fact, UBC's standards prohibit bulk forwarding of all your UBC email to a Gmail or any other personal email account. There's some exceptions to that. We have a lot of people, for example, at UBC that have dual appointments where they work like at a health authority and at the institution. Those people can forward their mail. That came around from the past when it was a little harder on your phone to set up multiple email accounts. It's so easy now that I would recommend just set up the multiple accounts. Then when you respond to a message, it actually comes from the email address the person sent the message to in the first place anyway. So what's your best solution? Something like a UBC collaboration tool. That's where you really want to be sharing all your data as much as possible. So Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, sending things through Zoom if you have it. I mean, Zoom is more sharing information verbally like we're doing right now. But if I need to share information with somebody in UBC or external to UBC, Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, and I say it that way because all those services use the same SharePoint backend, but they're all slightly different. And that would be almost a 1-hour discussion how they differ. But it's an interesting system. But at UBC, that file interface, that collaboration interface for Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint is acceptable for all levels of data classification. So it just makes it really easy. It doesn't matter what the classification I have. If I want to use OneDrive or Teams to share it with other people at UBC or my trusted partner, that's good. Okay. Sure.
What's considered as very high risk, and low risk?
So that's what Luke was talking about before. The standard and the sort of research modified version that we have on our website will give a bunch of different examples. But in general, it looks at a combination of how sensitive the information is in terms of any of those attacks that might happen, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, plus the impacts to both the institution, anybody whose data it's about, and the research project, should any of those things happen. And it is very case by case. So we provide examples, but there's a bazillion different kinds of data, and they all will be classified based on their particular case. It's the kind of the best I can quickly sum it. Okay.
So the question is, OneDrive has 1 terabyte limit. Is there infrastructure for sharing data that's over that size?
Yes. Come talk to ARC. ARC has a very big storage system called Chinook for sort of longer storage. And we have a system that facilitates transmitting that information very fast called Globus. So if you need to move big, like multi-terabytes, tens of terabytes, even hundreds of terabytes around, Globus is significantly faster. I see somebody going, yes. And a much better way to do it, because if you try to do that using some of these other standard means and something goes wrong halfway through the transfer, you have to start it over again, whereas Globus will just seamlessly fix that for you. And then there's places to store it. There's also, if it's low and medium risk information, then the Digital Research Alliance of Canada has storage resources that are available as well. And they also can handle multiple terabytes. So there's a couple of different things. Have a look on the ARC website for information about storage. And specifically, we have a storage by data classification helper. You can go there and have a look, and it'll say, like, what kind of data do you have? It'll ask you a bunch of questions. If you answer the questions, it'll tell you what storage is available for you based on the answers to those questions. That's something that Luke made. Okay, I'll carry on. Again, some other potential tools. So personal file sharing, collaboration messaging tools, again, like Dropbox, Google Drive, again, not permitted unless you go and get a privacy impact assessment done, which is something the institution will do when there's a need to look at a new tool. But they really don't want you using these personal tools. And there's one really big reason outside of cybersecurity for it. If I have a Dropbox that I've signed up for myself, it's a contract between me as a person and Dropbox. It has nothing to do with UBC at all. So if anything happens to me as a person, like I get hit by a bus, nobody can get to that data. And that's a really big problem for everybody else involved. So even there's no malicious activity in that situation at all, just really bad luck. It's not a secure way to store your data because it locks it off for people. But there's also privacy legislation around freedom of information requests that kind of prohibit the institution from allowing those kind of tools, because we would have to provide information based on a freedom of information request that if it's stored in one of those tools, again, we can't get to. So that's part of the reason why those are discouraged. And mobile storage devices have to be encrypted. So you can put things on some sort of a mobile storage device, but you have to encrypt that device. And that's because those things are really easy to lose or get stolen. And a laptop is included in that mix. Yes?
Zoom about encryption. So when you say encrypted, is it just putting a password on the file, or there's something else you could do?
There's a lot more. I'm not going to answer it now because the whole second section we're going to talk about is all encryption all the time. So give us probably about another 15 minutes, and then we'll talk nothing but encryption for a little while. And that's because there's been a major bunch of changes to UBC's requirements around encryption. And so Luke and I are going to run through all of those. So we'll get to it in detail. If the question is not answered by the next section, then ask it again, please. Still on here, websites hosted within Canada. This comes up quite often because of web applications. So it might be that it's not like we're looking at just a web page like somebody's blog. We're actually uploading sensitive information into a website that's doing some kind of processing or something to it, an actual tool. And that's fine as long as the connection is HTTPS encrypted. Saying that again. That's encryption in transit. So it's just encrypting the connection between my computer and that site when I'm uploading the data. Hardly any websites are not encrypted in transit anymore. They all have HTTPS. It's very rare to come across a website that doesn't, but it is a requirement. So if you happen to find somebody that hasn't, don't use that for any very high risk or medium risk information. Okay?
The question is, where would a Git repository fit within these categories?
It entirely depends what is contained in the Git repository. So the question was, and we see this one a lot. Like if I've got a Git repository, and I'll give you a really good example. We're starting to use a Git repository and Markdown to write the information security standards themselves. That's how we're editing them, because then we can see all of our changes. We get commits. If you're not familiar with this code language, don't worry about it. But what's in the repository is basically the cybersecurity standards in draft form. This is public information. We're going to publish it anyway. So it's a low-risk Git repository. Conversely, if I'm using a Git repository in partnership with a private company and I've got a contract with them that says we'll protect their information, their proprietary code, that might suddenly make that particular Git repository high risk, because now it's got something that needs a totally different control set put around it. So really the classification depends entirely on what goes into it. Git repositories are effectively a storage form, database in a way. So it depends what you put into it. One thing I would caution, it's very common to accidentally put sensitive information into a Git repository. So if you fear that's going to happen, this is one of those great times where you can just classify up. Like if you think you might accidentally have somebody put a secret or something in there, just say that it's high risk, even when it might not be. I see a question. I think two questions. I think you were first, so go ahead. It's closer to the mic.
And going from that, so a Git repository, but that's separate from putting it in a GitHub repository, which is the Microsoft software. Is that correct?
Yeah, you'd have to look at that as well. So just to clarify, if not everybody here is totally familiar with Git and Git code and what these are. Git is a version control repository that's frequently used for code. It can also be used to just track any sort of changes. And Git can just be a folder on your computer where you commit changes to something, but you can also put that onto a service like GitHub, GitLab, Gitea, and have that as an online thing. And the classification of the data in the repository would remain the same regardless of where it was. But how you would want to, whether or not you might even choose to not use the online version based on the classification of the information, could be based on the classification of the information in that Git repository. So if I said, okay, this Git repository is low risk, it's fine for me to put it on GitLab, I'll just do that. But this other one I have is very high risk information in this Git repository. I'm going to run it locally and not put it online because it wouldn't be as secure. You'd have to, this is where we do an analysis of where it's going online and how it's protected and configured to determine whether it meets the controls required for the classification of information in the Git repository.
Does UBC have like, I mean, I should do my own analysis, but does UBC have like a published list of tiers of high versus low quality online Git? Like, is GitLab better than GitHub?
Sort of.
Maybe I'm getting
But
off topic.
we have a, not a little bit, but it's a good question. So, and then we'll get to yours. Same question?
If you have this, let's say it's high risk, you already determined, but then you want to share it with, because you are collaborating with members of your lab. So what we should use, like you saying, like if we have like a GitHub, GitLab, or like if UBC had some agreement with, I don't know, Bitbucket, something.
Okay. So I'll try to answer it more generic than just looking at Git. There's a couple of different things at play. So one thing you can do is go and look and see if UBC has already conducted a privacy impact assessment on a tool. There is a published set of that on the Privacy Matters website right now. And they're publishing more. They're trying to increase the number of things that are listed because they've done a lot more PIAs than what's actually listed on that site. And they're trying to put more information out there. You have to be careful when you do that, though, to look at what the PIA took into account. And they'll list the information classification and the audience. So they might say, well, we looked at this tool, but we only assumed they were putting low risk information into it. So if that's the case, you'd need to ask them to do a new one. Now, if it's only for research information, that's when you'd want to come back to us. So we do something called a security threat risk assessment against tools. And we can look and see, based on the tool, and more importantly, how it's been configured, because the configuration, because we can't, for example, do an assessment against AWS. There's a million different ways from Sunday to configure even a single service in AWS. We'd have to look at, okay, what exactly are you doing in AWS? How's it set up? How do people log in? Who has access? How's it configured? All those kind of questions. And we've got a way to basically ask a bunch of questions. Then we'll decide whether it's a fairly low risk thing, you're probably good, or we might go and do an actual deep dive assessment into that tool. And we have done this for some tools. Usually those are done for fairly niche things so far, but it's ramping up. So I would suggest if it's one of the UBC approved tools that's right in the standard, like Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, the Outlook email that's part of FastMail, or a TeamShare network storage, you're good. Just follow what is in this standard. If it's not one of those, you can check the PIAs, and probably the easiest thing is just ask us. We'll happily try to help you navigate those kind of questions. Okay, good.
Scott, there's a question coming from Zoom.
Okay.
So it said, when you say websites outside of Canada, is it like websites with domains like .uk or .cn and et cetera?
Yes, but it can also be just .com. So, and the reason this comes up, this again is about across the board, UBC wide. So I think some here may know, some here might not know, our BC privacy legislation used to say you can't store information that's personal in nature outside of Canada. Like you can't store it in the US is really where it came about. That changed a few years ago. And the new rule says you can't store it outside of Canada unless you do a privacy impact assessment, which is why the language here is written that way. So it doesn't really matter what the domain is, it matters where the site exists. So in fact, if you're hosting a website in the United States and it's a .ca website, it's a website hosted outside of Canada. That's why it's phrased that way. So the domain doesn't really matter. It matters where the data actually will be residing. That's the important bit. Okay. The other two in here are a little more obvious. If you're trying to send some other method, so SSH, FTPS, SFTP, Globus, you can do that as long as they're authenticated and the transmission is encrypted. And then finally, fax. fax just won't die. Some people are still sending faxes. I used to work in a place at a lab that was still getting faxes with patient information on it coming to the wrong number. It is infuriating. Please don't use fax. We really can come to this century now. Okay. So there's a couple other things we should think about. I want to make sure we get through this because we're going on a long time. Lots of great questions, though. Sharing and reuse of data. Unless you need to, don't share data. And it says avoid like raw data. I would just say in general. It's really, really hard to steal something that doesn't exist. So don't put it on a share site if it doesn't need to be on the share site. And as soon as it doesn't need to be on the share site anymore, just take it off. Proper de-identification, we've touched on that a little bit. Some of the risks associated with it, there's lots of tools that say they do de-identification. You kind of have to spot check those tools. They may be doing good de-identification, they may not. You might have a data set that having two data sets together is effectively a re-identified data set, and you have to take that into account. Use the right tools where possible. Have a process in place to check for that integrity attack. So remember we were talking about what happens if your data goes wrong? There are lots of tools that will validate that your data hasn't changed. And I don't mean like you going in and looking, but this happens really frequently with code, that especially in Git repositories we've been talking about, where it does a hash of the data. That's just basically a mathematical calculation that comes out with a number. And if anything in that data changes and you run that hash again, you'll get a different number. So it's a real easy way to check. You just run the hash. Later on, you want to make sure it's the same. You run the hash again. If the numbers are the same, they're hexadecimal numbers. If they're the same, nothing changed. And that's a really good way to do an integrity check. Talked about sharing only in the necessary. You'll often need consent. We haven't really spoken much about ethics yet. Ethics will sometimes kind of tell you this is high-risk data. Unfortunately, the ethics data classifications are different than the UBC data classifications. They have a 3-set system, whereas we have the 4, but it's roughly the same as just taking our high risk and very high risk and sticking them together into one bucket. And then you kind of match what ethics does. Using safe redaction information methods, that's again, if you're creating a PDF of something and you just draw a black box over top of it, and then look in the PDF, the text is still probably there under the black box. So that's not a safe redaction method. You have to be really careful how you actually redact information when you're creating a document. And there's tools that can help with that if you need to, or come and talk to somebody. And then when you're sharing through public repositories, obviously you have to be careful what you put there. Okay, we made it through this part. Is there any other questions? We've had so many. This is really good. Okay. Then I will pass it back to Luke for the next bit. We just have to flip over to a different presentation. So give us 1 second. I think we could break after this. Do this one and then do a break. Sorry, my mouse keeps drifting to the other side. I think we're good.
Okay. We are back. Okay. So the second portion of this class today will be talking about UBC encryption requirements. So Scott, well, there were some questions about encryption earlier, and that's where we're going to sort of dive into what are UBC encryption requirements and how they changed and why you should know about them now more than ever. And again, we're using Slido, so if some people just joined us, mostly online, you can use Slido. The code is right there. There's also a QR code that you can use to ask your questions. Okay, so why did UBC decided this year? Well, I mean, they've been working on it for a few years, but why did UBC decided to change the requirements for encryption? There's a couple of there's many reasons, but I wanted to target a couple for today's presentation. Of course, emerging cyber risks. So as new technology comes in and as new security control, new ways to go around them can also arise. So when it comes to encryption, as encryption gets better, ways to break encryption gets better. That's how it is. Emerging technologies, well, the obvious one, and there are people here working with it, is AI. So if you're working, well, AI is emerging technologies, but there's also all sorts of things when we talk about emerging technologies and all sorts of things that can start affecting data that is stored somewhere and that can be easily taken away or scraped or read or whatever. And then decentralization of storage, well, it's obviously just everything's moving into cloud now. So we don't have, we have much less physical storage, say in our lab, or we don't keep that much stuff on a hard drive, we'll keep stuff in the cloud. So that also creates new challenge that UBC needed to address from an encryption perspective. So why is it important to encrypt your data? Well, in terms of the standard, there's a couple of risks that the encryption address here, and I'm going to talk about them here and also in a little bit more depth in what it means for the research community. So why is it important? Encryption is intended to mitigate risks such as physical access. If you encrypt your hard drive and your laptop gets stolen, or if you have a USB key that contains information, if that USB key is encrypted, when you lose it, and I say when, because eventually it always happens, then the data is encrypted and whoever finds it is not able to read the data on it. File system access would be something like if you have a, say, something like S3 buckets, something like that, or if you have essentially a collection of files that lives in a place, that's a file, that's essentially file system access. I'm trying to remember the example we had in mind.
A locked trunk.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So the analogy here that I can use is physical theft. Say you have a trunk and that trunk is locked with a padlock, then that's physical access. Nobody can access the trunk. Then in that trunk, you have a little box that also has a lock on it. That's your file system access. But if someone accesses the trunk, they still need to access that little box. And if they access the box, they can access the file. The third one is file access. So file access would be, let's say in that box, you have all of these folders, and these folders themselves are protected with some kind of protection, right? So then you have your file protection. So it helps mitigate file access. And then finally, database. Database is really different, but database is just, I won't go into too much of explaining what a database is, but like database is just protecting data from wherever it sits in an organized or disorganized fashion in the database. Okay, so again, going back to the standards and how we work at UBC, and the standard that address encryption at UBC is Standard Information Security Standards M7. And yes, there's a lot of standards, but we're talking about this one, but you'll see at the end, they're sort of all connected and they refer to each other a lot. So you might see a lot of these throughout this presentation here. But in the new update of the standard, there's this table that you can see here. And the table sort of explain what the encryption tier are and what kind of protection they offer. And it goes from essentially 0 to 3+, and I'll explain here a little bit what they mean, and then I'll go into what it means for researchers, because if you just look at that, it might be slightly confusing. So tier 0 is no encryption. Obviously, if there's no encryption, you're not protected. It doesn't protect you against anything here. Tier 1 would be full disk or device level encryption. What it means is it's essentially physical theft. If you encrypt a hard drive and somebody steals the hard drive, they can't get the data that's on the hard drive. And then you have tier 2, which is full volume encryption. So full volume encryption means you will encrypt a volume. A good example would be virtual volume if you're working with virtual machines. The thing with tier 2 encryption, a volume encryption, if you have access to the volume, you'll have access to everything. right? So as soon as you can access the volume, you can access everything that's in it. So everything that's in it is not encrypted itself, but the volume itself is encrypted. So if somebody steals that volume, they can't access what's in it. And then tier 3 is file encryption. So file encryption is each file themselves are encrypted, and that's very specific. So in this case, if a file gets stolen, then you can't have access because it's encrypted. There was a question earlier about if it can, so if I just put a password on it, is it sufficient? It really depends what you're working with, but generally, no. Generally, when it comes to file encryption, you want to use a file encryption tool like Cryptomator, Veracrypt, or something like that, are tools that are designed to really encrypt the data, and it's going to do a better job than just like if you have a spreadsheet and you put a password on it. It's not the best way because there's a lot of ways around these nowadays, especially when it comes to spreadsheets, because spreadsheets is it's one of the popular things that people use to store stuff, especially like I was talking earlier when we were talking about information classification about your master list that has your personal information and your crosswalk. And usually this is a spreadsheet that lives somewhere, and people will have a password on it, but it's not necessarily the best way to protect. Anyway, okay. And then tier 3 is application level database encryption. So that would mean, and I won't get too much into this one because it's kind of technical, but it means like if you have a database, each row or each piece of information is encrypted. So if somebody gets access to the database, it'll be very hard for them to retrieve information. So the difference here between, and I want to show the difference between tier 3 plus and tier 3. So tier 3 is, when it comes to database, transparent database encryption means if you get access to the database itself is encrypted. So if you steal the database, you can't get the information. But if you get access to the database, you have access to everything that's in the database. Tier 3 plus, it adds an extra layer on top of it. So even if you get access to the database, you probably need to do an extra step to get access to the data. Yeah, so there were a couple footnotes in the standard that I can talk about it really briefly here. Physical access, of course, it's all mobile, your laptop, computers, servers, and all that. I'll get into that later. If you're encrypting a hard drive and you're using partition, we usually recommend to encrypt all volume. Because if you just encrypt a portion, then you expose a portion and there might be some leakage, or you might store something in the wrong partition, and then it becomes available. And then database, well, this one talks about mitigating the risk, so I'll skip this one. Okay, so I went into the more like how it looked on the standard. Now I want to talk, okay, good, you told us that. What does this mean for us researchers here now? Okay, so when we're talking about computer, mobile device, portable storage, if you have portable hard drive, USB sticks, and then your computers and a mobile device, the requirement is tier 1 encryption. Now, if I just go back here, tier 1 encryption is device level encryption. What it means for a computer, it would be like BitLocker, it would be FileVault for Apple, Lux, or whatever you're using for Linux. For your mobile device, it's usually encrypted. Most mobile devices nowadays are encrypted by default, but you have to check with your manufacturer. And if it's anything else, like portable hard drive, USB stick, then just there's a guideline that's also available in the UBC on the UBC CIO website that just tells you sort of what you have to do to encrypt whatever you're using here. Okay. Now, the obvious question that usually comes in after that is, okay, well, I am not using a UBC device. I use my own computer. So what do I do? Okay, so there's a couple of solutions for this one. The first one is, well, if you can, use a UBC device. So I know in research it might be complicated because often we work with students, we work with people that are not necessarily UBC employees, but Where possible, having a UBC device is always the easiest way because UBC device already come equipped with the encryption. You don't have to do anything. It's all set up for you. Second solution, don't store the information on your personal device. Instead, use one of the sharing tools that we talked about in the previous presentation. So our, UBC OneDrive, TeamShare, Home Drive, whatever we have. These tools, OneDrive being a bit of the exception because it still has a local copy if you're installing the local application. But if you're using the online version, then the data doesn't reside on your machine. And in this case, it's better protected. If you cannot do these two, then does your device supports hard drive encryption? And if you have Windows Pro or Enterprise, the answer is likely yes. The thing is, most consumer device or most devices that we can buy at Best Buy will have Windows Home, which does not support encryption, so that becomes a challenge, and you sort of have to use a workaround. But then solution 4, which I think is like, if you cannot use a UBC supported device or a UBC tool to store your data, is probably the better solution, is just go higher in the encryption tiers. Just remember, we had tier 1, which is encrypting your hard drive. But if it's not possible, if you encrypt the file, then you're at tier 3 encryption. So you don't have to worry about things because the file is encrypted. So whoever has access to the machine, it doesn't matter that the hard drive is encrypted if the files on it are encrypted. Okay, so for those that work, say, with server, either in a data center or in a lab, this is how it changed a little bit things. So when it comes to servers that lives in the UBC data center, UBC has a data center, or a data center that's similar to UBC data center, and there's another information security standard here, security standard M9. You don't have to go and check this one unless you're working with a server in a data center, so don't worry about this. But the requirement here is tier 0 if it's in the UBC data center, or like if it's in essentially AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure. These all meet the requirement of that standard, and the requirement is you don't need encryption. But there is a caveat in the note here, and I'll talk about cloud later, how it works. But essentially, if you have very high risk information, you probably want to do at least tier 2 or tier 3 encryption, so at least volume or file encryption. And I'll say in a general sense, if you have information that's very valuable to your research, or that's very risky, like very high risk information, just encrypt it. If it's something that you think like, hey, this is very valuable to us, and if it gets stolen, there might be some repercussion on either the university or us as a researcher, or on our research, or on participants, encrypt it. It's just best to just have it encrypted, and then you don't have to worry about it. Now, for those who are using servers that are not in the data center, and I'm thinking about those that have servers in a lab or servers living under a desk somewhere in the university, we see that a lot. Then these one needs to have their hard drive encrypted. So if you have a server in your lab that is not, it's obviously not in the data center, make sure that your hard drive are physically encrypted. And then virtual machine, containerized environment, virtual hard drive. If you're working in a virtual environment, these also need to be encrypted. There's a couple of caveats to that. Of course, if you're working in Sockeye, which is our system that lives in a data center, you might be working with containerized environment. But it's containerized. You might be working with containerized environment, but because it's in the data center, there's some differences, and you don't necessarily need to encrypt these disks. I saw a question coming up quickly asking what the UDC is.
Yeah, so there are two questions. One is the UCD, and the other one is what's the ISS-U5?
Okay,
so UDC stands for University Data Center. UBC has its own data center that lives in the, where is it? Yeah, exactly. So we have our own data center. So UDC is UBC University Data Center, and it's where our systems at our and then other And then other servers, you can also have co-location in there. So if you have a server and you're like, I don't want to have it in the lab, I'd rather have it in the data center, you can probably reach out to UBC IT and ask for co-location, and they can give you space. I know it's restricted, so I don't want to say like, don't jump there and say, I have 10 server I want to bring. They might tell you no, but they do have space for co-location, and so that might be useful. And ISSM9, so ISS stands for Information Security Standards, and M9, so there's two kinds of, I won't get too much into this, but there's two kind of standards. There's standards that starts with the letter U and standard that starts with the letter 9, and U stands for user, M stands for management. So Information Security Standard Management number 9, and this one is called Security of the University Data Center or something.
Physical security of data centers.
There you go. So yes, that's ISS. Okay, I said I was going to be talking about cloud, so I'll go over this quickly here. But in cloud environment, when it comes to underlying infrastructure, I was talking about the university data center. It's the same concept. Underlying infrastructure is the physical hard drive in the data center at Google. These don't need to be encrypted, and there would be no way for us to check that they are anyway. So there's no requirements for this one. All the major cloud providers, they do meet the requirements, so that's not a problem in this case. When it comes to infrastructure as a service, if you have your virtual machines, if you have your virtual storage volume that you're using there, these need to have tier 2 encryption. So at least storage level encryption, or encrypted the entire volume level encryption. When it comes to file storage platform, when we talk about S3, Azure Blobs, or whatever you're using in the cloud to store your data, if it's a service that you're using, or a platform that you're using, then these needs to have tier 2 encryption. And then database services is the same. Like if you're using RDS, if you're using Cosmos DB, if you're using any database service, these need to have tier 2 encryption. Again, keep in mind the note that's here. If you have very high risk information, tier 3 is recommended where technically possible. It's usually better, especially again, if you have something that's very valuable, encrypted. Okay, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but there are exemptions. Of course, if you're using a kiosk, or if you have a public workstation or something like that, then this doesn't really apply. You can consult the standard ISS U5, Information Security Standard. U5 is the encryption standard at UBC, but it just says like, here's what needs to be encrypted, here's what does not need to be encrypted, and then you'll have reference to all sorts of things. But in a nutshell, that's what we just talked about. Okay, I'm just going to make a quick pause here. Do we have other questions? Any in the room here for now? Okay, awesome. Now, if you're encrypting something, you usually will have encryption keys. So if you encrypt a file or a volume or a disk, you'll have some encryption key to manage. And Information Security Standard M7, it's a different standard that talks about cryptographic requirements, essentially gives us information on how these encryption keys needs to be protected. And there's a lot to it. I'm not going to go through everything, but here are a few of the key points that are important to know. Where possible, generally you want to use something that's software generated. So don't use like the name of your dog and the name of your the color of your first car as the key. This is not good. It's going to be cracked in minutes. Nowadays, with good software, attackers are able to crack easy passwords very easily. Use something that's software generated, because it's going to generate either a long string of gibberish or a bunch of words that are completely random for creating the key, and you don't have to worry about it. Now, connected to that, use a key vault. It can be something like Bitwarden. It can be something like KeePass. It can be something like whatever key vault you're using. Just don't have this in a notebook by your desk on a Post-it or whatever. Just use a key vault. It's easier. Most key vault also include the generator to software generate keys. So for example, in Bitwarden, you can go click the generator and say, create for me a 50-character password. And it'll do it, and you don't have to know it. You don't have to worry about it. You just have to store it in the vault and sort of know one very long, complicated password that gets you to your vault. That'll get you to all your passwords. One important thing, and that's specifically, well, more specifically if you're working with cloud, is keys should be stored at UBC where technically possible. And the reason we decided to add that to the standards is a lot of the companies, well, AWS, for example, if you're using some of their service, they'll be like, okay, cool, you encrypt that S3 bucket. We can manage the key for you. So we'll manage the encryption key and you don't have to worry about it. But then the key is somewhere, it's managed by someone you don't know and you don't really know who has access to it. I'm not saying that the service is not good, it's probably good. I'm saying that ideally you want to have control over the keys to your valuable data. So where possible, you want to store the keys with UBC and not with like the vendor. If you're working with a specific vendor, I'm thinking about software as a service. So if you use a software that's online, it's not installed on your machine, you just go in, you log in, and you put in data, you want to ask the vendor how they protect their keys. Because obviously, you will not be able to store the keys with UBC because it's a software as a service. You just go in and you use the service. But you want to ask the vendor, hey, how do you protect is my data encrypted? And if they say yes, you're like, cool, tell us how you protect your keys. And if they cannot answer the question, then maybe you want to look into a different solution. Okay, and then finally, if you're working on a custom apps, and I'm talking to those online and here in the room that are doing code, if you're coding something, please don't forget your key somewhere in the code. Well, you're in pre-prod, because it happens a lot. People will be coding their application, and then they're like, I don't want to be re-entering the key every time while I'm developing this thing. So they just put in the code somewhere in a script, and then they forget about it, and then they post it, and then the app is out there, and then the encryption key is exposed. It happens a lot. There was some talk about Git and GitHub earlier. It's the same thing. Like if you keep your script, a lot of people will store scripts to, say, run high-performance computing. They store it on either their Git repo or GitHub. And the script contains the key, and they sort of forget about it. And then it's on GitHub, and it's available publicly. And remember, once it's out there, it's gone. It's public. Once it's exposed on the internet, even for 10 seconds, it's over. It's game over. Yeah.
Questions. First, the Slido question is, does UBC provide any file encryption tool for UBC researchers to use? I'll read the other one. So there's another question on Zoom. So the Apple iCloud auto-generated password, would that work?
So it's better than nothing. If you're using the one that's provided by the browser, like Chrome or Firefox or Apple, it's better than just writing and trying to remember passwords. Ideally, I would recommend using something that's a tool that's more specific to encryption, just because it tends to do a better job. And also, just going back to that control piece. The thing with these tools, like the Apple, say the one that comes with your browser, is if you have access to the browser, you can access the passwords. There's generally not that extra step of like, you need to know that key that gets you access to all of your other keys. Just going back to that previous questions, can you just repeat it?
For sure. So the question is, does UBC provide any file encryption tool for UBC researchers to use?
UBC doesn't provide specifically tool, but they have tools that are recommended. You can either look, I think on the UBC IT website, they have a couple of tools, but we do have it also on our website, information about some of the tools, but Vericrypt and Cryptomator are probably the most common one that we see around for these, but there's no specific tools that's where there's a license. Those are open source tools.
Yeah, I was going to add to that one. The reason that one isn't provided is because there's so many different use cases, and it often depends on the use case. And then there's a lot of open source tools that will do that for you. But yeah, the two that Luke mentioned, we use quite frequently. They're better suited for different use cases too.
Okay, any more questions here? All right. Actually, I'm passing it on to you.
Okay. I'm going to go pretty quick through these because I want to have time for other things. But one of the great things that we've started to do in a lot of the UBC information security standards is add case study documents that are additional documents. And I've just shown, if you look, this is the actual web page where the standards live. And if you look on the page, there'll be these resources buttons. And if you open up the resources, there's more documents there that provide additional information. So that QR code will take you to this page. And look for the case studies. We're starting to add them for more and more of the standards, and they just help you with examples. It's just really more examples. So these are all the case studies that we have in the encryption case studies. There's 11 different possible situations. I'm just going to look at a few of them because some of them are more applicable than others. And the first one is this server containing high-risk information. So it's a physical server, and the example there is listed quite clearly. So it's a department has a server. It's in the UBC hybrid cloud environment, or it's an OpenStack. It's another cloud environment. But and that is actually, that example would be, and it's in the UDC, so in that university data center. And the server contains some files that are high-risk information. That's the example. And what's required here is you can do tier 2 for the volumes, or as Luke said, it's always recommended if you can to do 3, or if there was a database involved, 3+, where you're really doing the best possible encryption. 3 and 3+ are always your goal. If you have that supported, like if you're using an application and you can press a button that says encrypt all the files, do that and you're done. It's great if you have that option. If you don't have that option, you have to look at one of the other approaches. So that's one, but if you then look at the exact same situation where there's only low or medium risk information on the server. So example is exactly the same, but the classification of the information now is only medium or low risk information, then just tier 2 is fine. That's all you need to do. So again, that information classification we talked about at the beginning, this is one of the places where it plays in. Let's say you've got high risk information on a server, but it's only there for 5 minutes. We get this example quite often. The short answer is it doesn't change a lot. You still really need to encrypt it. Now, in this case, the difference is this server is in a lab. So a practical example of this is you've got some sort of an instrument that's collecting information. Maybe it's an MRI machine. It puts it on a server, and then, you know, like 2 hours later, it gets shipped off that server to a secure storage location. That happens quite often. In this situation, you don't have a database in this case, and there's only that short period. So again, tier 3 is your best option, but you can get away with tier 1 or tier 2 for this one as well, unless, and it's noted here, all the volumes would need tier 1 or tier 2 if you're doing the volume level. So it's all of them. Luke talked about this before. Another example, I can just expand on it a little. If you've got a Linux machine and it's got like 4 different partitions, and if you only encrypt one of the partitions, that's not enough. You have to do all of the partitions because we're never quite sure where that information might route. A Linux workstation is another one. This is no different than a Windows workstation, really. It's got a home directory, and this is why the volume bit I was just talking about, that's what this example is really looking at. You have to make sure that all the volumes have tier 2 encryption, not just like your home drive. And this came about because we actually had somebody that did this. They encrypted the boot partition of their Linux box and then stored all their data in a different partition. So their data wasn't encrypted at all. It was just the file system that was encrypted. So it didn't really help.
Scott, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm hoping I'm reading this correctly. So it's how to apply tier 3 encryption to a SQLite database file.
So it would depend. SQLite, for those that aren't familiar, is actually a database that's just a single file. And if you've got a really small database or you're doing it personally, it's actually a really handy way to do simple database operations. There's a couple of different ways you could encrypt that. So you could encrypt the volume that it's on, but if you really wanted to just encrypt it, I don't think SQLite itself offers transparent database encryption, which is usually a function of the database software you're using. So Postgres or MS SQL or Oracle or MariaDB, they have database encryption built into the engine that runs the database. I'd have to verify whether SQLite can do that. I don't believe it does. So you couldn't really do the transparent database encryption, which is tier 3, but you could do tier 3 plus. You would have to build the encryption technology into the application that's accessing the database. So the application, like let's say I type in some sensitive information, then the application would have to encrypt it into an object before it stores that object in the database. The trick with doing those is it can kind of ruin your database for search, for indexed queries, for things like that. It slows it down. But that's how you'd have to do it. Usually then what people do is they have the searchable information and then the encrypted information in 2 different columns in the database. So you'd use the searchable information to find what you're looking for, and then you would decrypt it as you need it. So that's kind of how you'd do that. Okay, one more example here, an AWS S3 bucket. As Luke was mentioning, if this is based on some storage of information that's just going into the bucket, you have that option of turning on it's again kind of transparent encryption with AWS. That means that AWS staff still would have access to everything in that bucket, and anybody who has a login to get to that bucket still has access to everything in it. So if you have really sensitive information, this one's containing high risk as the example, you really should be doing something that encrypts the objects in that bucket before they ever get to the bucket. That's the safe way to do it. Is there one more? No. Okay, so again, if you want to go look at the case studies, there's a bunch more in there. Give you some more information about what's there. And again, I would encourage you, if you haven't, go and have a look at the information security standards. We will just keep quoting them all day. So that's the end of this section. Now we've got, how much time do we have left? So there's not much time left. So here's what I'm going to propose. It's a little bit unorthodox. I'd like to carry on with the next one. And then feel free to just leave. I won't consider it rude if you need a quick break, but I'll just carry on and we can keep going if that works for everybody. I'm not seeing anybody vehemently opposed to that idea. Give me one second. While this is starting up, I'm going to warn you that in the 30 minutes we have left, this presentation has 70 slides. Don't panic. The intention is not to go through all of this. The intention is to go through as much of it as we can, and then you get to take the slide deck home and use it as a reference. It's really a reference deck, but I'll go through some of this as we go. And this is designed specifically, same thing with Slido, for questions or just ask. This one's a little more interactive, so I've asked Rachel to just interrupt me if anybody has a question, and feel free to jump out. Maybe we'll get some discussion going on. A couple of things I want to cover before I dive into this. Everybody comes to cybersecurity with a whole bunch of varied backgrounds. So some people, and I can tell already in the room, there's some pretty technical folks in here. We've been talking about Git repos and commits and storage, and then other people might be, this whole thing is a bit of a black box and I don't know what it is. I try my best to approach this from all those different angles, but what I would say is if I start talking about something and you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, or I'm using strange acronyms, and I love that people have been asking what the acronyms mean. We're very bad for that. Feel free to interrupt. Security is all about multiple layers. And we've been kind of talking about that. The encryption is an excellent example. You can do multiple different things to make things more secure. 70 slides in this deck. Don't try to do all of them. They're all different things you can do. Any one of them that you do will make you more secure. The more you do, the more secure you'll be, but some of them are easy to do, some of them are hard to do. Some of them might be easy to do for a particular individual and less easy to do for somebody else. My point in this is really just try to do as many things as you can. And don't feel bad. Like the risk is that if you look at this and go, oh my gosh, there's too much, I just won't do anything. Don't do that. Pick one, do it, Some of them are pretty easy to do. So I want to start with a little evaluation of the concept of trust when it comes to cybersecurity, because I think it's an important issue to think through. And I'm going to give you the example of a ladder. If I go to the forest and find a tree and chop down the tree and mill my own lumber and design a ladder and build it out of the lumber from that tree myself, and I test it and I store it properly and I finish it and make sure I've used all the right stuff, the only person I need to trust is me in that situation. Nobody's going to do that. I'm pretty good at woodworking, definitely not going to go and build a wooden ladder from a tree that I cut down myself. No, I'm going to go to the hardware store. I'm going to buy a ladder and just use it. But if you think about it, I had to trust a whole bunch of people in order to do that. I had to trust that somebody cut down the right kind of tree. They're not building it out of balsa wood. I had to trust the hardware was correct. I had to trust they designed it properly and it's not going to collapse under my weight. I have to trust that the store stored it properly and it's not rotten. And I have to trust that it's fit for the purpose I want. That's just a ladder. Think about when you're using a piece of software, even if it's simple, all the people we're trusting associated with the use of that software. Where it's hosted, who wrote it, what it's doing, who has access to the data in addition to you, where it might be sending data, is there potentially a bad software running on the system that's running that same piece of software? There's a lot of trust involved. It gets rapidly complicated when we start talking about things even as simple as Windows. Think of how much trust goes into just using Windows, quite a bit. A lot of what we'll talk about with security is related to trust. The other one is, regardless of what I say in any of these slides, always follow the institutional policies. It might not be UBC's, I'll say of wherever you're currently working under the auspices of. So if you're working at a health authority at the moment, you have to follow their policies. If you're working at a company, you have to follow their policies. If you're a volunteer at a particular organization, you have to follow their policies. Here at UBC, we have our own policies. And you might read about things that say something that one of these policies says is outdated. There's a better way to do it nowadays. Doesn't matter. Follow the policy. The reason is all the institutional supports and structures and frameworks are built around those policies. So even though the best practice, modern practice, might be something that's a little different, you're always better to follow the policy because that's how the institution's set up. Okay, there's two kinds of slides in this deck. One looks like this. This is a proactive slide. This means something you can do now to be more secure and prevent bad things from happening. They're pretty straightforward. The most important bit of this is just the top right corner. There's 3 items. One is implementation. That's how hard it'll be to do this, based on my guess. One is how much of a day-to-day interference it's going to be in your life. And finally, how much of an improvement will it be for you from a security perspective. The other kind of slide is a reactive slide. This is when something's gone wrong, what you do to deal with the fact that something's gone wrong. And there's a geekometer in the top of this is how technical do you need to be able to do this thing on your own. Because sometimes you don't necessarily want to try. This is proof that I do have links to all the resources I'm going to mention. And 2 of them, actually, it's already come up. Luke has mentioned KeePass, Bitwarden, Cryptomator. They're all on here. So that might be helpful. But one more plug for the QR code for Slido in case you need it, because I do encourage you to interrupt me with questions as we go through. Okay, we can finally get going.
There's a question.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding, so we mentioned like tools that UBC have put on a list and they comply with security. I just wanted to know your thoughts on like library packages. Like if you are a researcher and doing, I don't know, Python working to get around your data and there's a bunch of packages that you could use. I always thought like, how do you assess, if you have any thoughts, how to assess what to download? Because yeah, it's always had in my back on my mind that I actually don't know, like the trust thing that you said. Like, I don't know if I trust these people, and then, but my main job is the research, right? Not the software part.
Open source package vulnerability is a very big and complicated topic. It's a really good question. Don't mind spending some time on it. I have a really good friend that works at MDA Space. They're building software for satellites. They have this problem. They're like, what's in our code? We've got all these libraries. So there's actually tools you can get that will look at all the different things that go into a piece of code. There's a concept you can look up called an SBOM, a software bill of materials. And for certain bits of code, you now have to submit one if you're going to be doing work with certain groups, like the government will want an SBOM. Some commercial entities and vendors will want it. There's no kind of rule of thumb for a safe package, because one of the things that the bad guys are doing a lot now is trying to inject malware into open source packages. The rules of thumb, I would say, would probably be this. Think long and hard before you add a package into your piece of software that does a simple, tiny little thing, but is a massive package with a billion functions. If you need one function and your library contains 6,000 functions, maybe see if you can find a different solution to that problem, so you're not building this huge landscape of potential threats just for one simple thing. Sometimes just code it yourself. I know it sucks. Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind is, yeah, the more packages you add, the more vulnerability risk exists. So try to keep it to a minimum. And I'll add one more that's not in this deck yet, I don't think. There's a new concept, thanks to AI, called slop squatting. And what that means is, if you're coding with AI, sometimes it'll just say, oh, just include this package. That package doesn't exist. But wait, it does now, because the bad actors created that package and it's full of malware, because they know that the AI will tell you to include it. This is happening more and more. I know, it's like,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's a thing.
Yeah, so don't rely too much on, so even though AI is sort of cool, nice things that makes our life so much easier when it comes to coding, just keep that in mind. AI, it is proven now that it's doing a lot of mistakes, like pulling packages out of nowhere.
And the same package names. This is the bigger threat. It's not like it's just pulling random package names and every time you do it, it's a different one. Unfortunately, it's suggesting the same packages multiple times. So the bad actors go, oh, the AI keeps telling people to include the what's it package. I'll just create a what's it package and have it send all their data to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a paper or a document I can point people to that's talking about that? People think I'm alarmist for being concerned about the
So I know
bias-based coding fad.
there is a paper. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but I know how you can find it. An excellent podcast for cybersecurity geeks like us is called Security Now. When you look at the website, you'll go, this is from 1994. Trust me, it's okay. It's modern. They do a podcast every week. I think it was probably about 3 months ago-ish, maybe not that long.
Maybe not that long, yeah.
Maybe not that long.
But
their show notes are all on the site, and you can search the site. So if you search for slop squatting, the appropriate show should come up, and they reference a link in that show. That's the best I can do for you. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. Absolutely. Now we can get to the first slide. So this one is something just in general, if you ever have a cybersecurity issue come up. And this applies, actually, it's something, I used to volunteer in the Coast Guard. This is where this comes from. It's called SAP, Stop, Assess, Plan, Proceed. And it's a method you can approach to any sort of an incident. And it might not be cybersecurity, it can just be my computer's gone dark, oh my goodness, what do I do? The basic premise is this: anytime something goes wrong, the first thing you should do is just stop. Take a moment, kind of look around going, okay, what's happened? Silence, just for a minute, figure it out, collect your breath, don't panic. Doesn't matter if there's a big red alarm thing flashing on your screen, you must pay $5,000 now or everything is end of the world. Still stop. Then assess everything. Take stock of what facts do you have. My computer's gone dark, but the power cord is now sitting on the floor. So maybe I just kicked the power cord, right? Could be that simple. but assess what you're going to do. And still, you haven't done anything yet. You've stopped, you've got your data, you're assessing your data. Next thing you do is, okay, here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do. And only when you have that plan do you actually proceed. The reason we did it in the Coast Guard is sometimes people will go rushing into an emergency situation. The worst example was there was a seaplane that crashed in Victoria Harbor, and this boat goes rushing into it, and they didn't notice the fuel slick all over the water, and then they started a fire just by going through this fuel slick with their engine. So they made the situation much worse very quickly because they didn't stop and assess the situation before they went there. So as a general tool, you can use it in a cybersecurity situation. It's quite valuable to just take that moment before you start doing something. We've kind of talked about this one, but I'll still harp on it. It's my favorite one. Luke's talked a lot about using a password vault, a secrets vault, a key vault, a password manager, whatever you call it. You really, really, really need to have a different password for every different account. That's not the same as having UBC's single sign-on, the CWL system, where it lets you sign into multiple things. It's only one account. But if you're creating a different account for Google and for Facebook and for Microsoft and for all these different personal things, you need a different password for each one. And I'll give you a quick preview as to why. So let's say I've got service A. I'll just say it's Facebook for whatever reason. And Facebook has a massive hack. They get everybody's passwords on Facebook. What are they going to do? Very, very first thing they're going to do is they're going to reset everybody's password. They're going to send you one of those notices that says, out of an abundance of caution, we have reset your password. Your information is now safe. Next time you log in, you'll have to pick a new password, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, in the background, the criminals have those password credentials. They've stolen that information and they're posting it to the dark web or to some pastebin site. And other criminals are downloading them, and within hours, they are trying it on every single other service that's out there. The problem is, none of those services were breached. They have not reset your password. They are not sending you a notification. To them, it looks like a normal login information. So service A, I used the example of Facebook, but what if it's Bob's Muffler, right? Bob's Muffler might not have the best security in the world, and Bob's Muffler might get hacked. But if you have the same email address and password on Bob's Muffler that you do on Google, and all your world is connected to Gmail, you might have a very, very big problem because of Bob's Muffler. If you have a different password for everything, it doesn't matter. If you want to find out just how many times your password may have been breached, you can go and have a look at haveibeenpwned.com. This is run by a security researcher. They will not ask you for your password. They'll ask you for your email address, and they will tell you how many different breaches that email has occurred or been visible in. I have an email that I've had since 1994, and it's plus 18 different breaches now. It's typical for most people to find themselves listed here, unless your email address is pretty new. If it's like a couple years old and you don't use it too much, then yeah, maybe not. But if you've used it on big sites like LinkedIn and Facebook, and there's a whole bunch in here, Under Armour was on here, Adobe, a whole bunch of different things that have been breached. If you're on one of those, then you'll show up. Doesn't worry me because I have a different password for everything because I use a password vault.
There's also a cool tool that's part of that site where you can go if you have a password you want to test. And it'll tell you like, okay, this is a strong password, or like, no, this password will. It essentially tells you how long it would take to crack that password. Yeah. So like, if you go on that tool and you type password, it's going to say it will crack in less than a second. But if you type whatever a password on there, it doesn't store anything. It just tells you, okay, this is a complicated enough password that will take 20,000 hours to crack or something like that. So it's a cool tool that's also part of that.
Yeah. So the advice is different password for everything. You kind of need to use a password vault to do this. I don't know about you. I have upwards of 1,000 usernames and passwords. I have no idea what the majority of my passwords are because they're all computer generated, and I've probably never even seen them because they're generated into I use KeePass. I think, Luke, you use Bitwarden.
Bitwarden.
Same, but different. But it generates the password for me. It stores it in its vault. I know the password to get into my vault. I know the password to get into my work laptop. That's about it. Everything else is just random strings of gibberish, as long as the site will let me make them. 128 characters sometimes. Just big strings of goo. But takes a little bit of getting used to. It's a slight interference, massive improvement for your security. One of the biggest. Use a password vault. I'm going to zip by this one. Use multi-factor authentication. It's a requirement at UBC if it's technically possible in your system to enable it. I would strongly suggest enabling this everywhere. It just adds yet another layer of security. So if somebody does somehow manage to get your username and password, they still have this next thing they have to get through is your multi-factor. And it's something else you have to watch for. But watch out for MFA fatigue. So hopefully this hasn't happened to anybody here. But if you start getting all these notifications on your phone, like Duo keeps popping up saying, approve this login, approve this login, approve this login. It's like constant. Some people just go, oh, stop, and they hit yes. That was a bad actor trying to get into your account that they somehow had the username and password for, and now they've got the MFA because you just did it for them. Some of the modern MFA tools are working around this, where you actually have to type in a code that's only visible on the website screen. That's to prevent exactly this. But again, if you're seeing a whole bunch of MFA pushes to a device and you're not currently trying to log in, I would recommend contacting your security person to say, I think my account might be compromised. Maybe go to the account and log in yourself using some other means. This is an important bit. If the attacker is constantly sending you MFA pushes and I try to log in myself, what is it going to do? It's going to send my device an MFA push. How do I know which one was me and which one was the attacker? Bit tricky. So you really want to try to find a different way to get to that device, or just phone them and say, I think my account's been compromised. Can you reset the password? Because that would be a really good indication. Okay, so we have 5 more minutes, and then you want 5 minutes. Okay, thanks. This is also related to account protection. How many people have seen the help me, I forgot my password button on the website? That will helpfully send you an email where you can reset your password. Effectively, what this means is the security of that site is absolutely no better than the security of whatever email address they're going to send that reset notification to, because it'll get you right in with a new password just without the username and password. I would therefore recommend, for the reset pathway, when you have an email, if the site gives you the option of having a different email, and some of the good ones do, Google does this, use an email that you do not use in your day-to-day life. Because what happens is the attackers will say, oh, this person's email is bob@gmail.com. I will try to get into bob@gmail.com, and they'll find a way to compromise that email and get access to it. Now they can reset all your passwords. But if you don't use bob@gmail.com as your reset pathway, then they can't. Similarly, if sites ask you questions like, tell me the name of your favorite pet, tell me your favorite teacher, tell me the color of your car, lie, 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 lie.
Yes.
In fact, mash on the keyboard with total gibberish and then store that in your password vault. Don't ever tell them the truth. Sites shouldn't do that. That's a very bad practice. It's been recommended against for a decade now, but they still do. If they do, don't give them the true answers. Just give them meaningless garbage, because half of the time the answers to those questions are available somewhere on your social media if you tell the truth. And there's no reason to tell the truth. So lying is good. Lying is secure in this case, in this one case. And then also think about if you're discarding anything that might have information about your authentication methods. So any way, you think of it like the back door to your house. You lock your front door, you put padlocks on it and stuff, but if you leave your back door open, the padlocks on the front door don't help all that much. I'll jump ahead to this one, and then maybe we'll stop after this one, unless there's questions. Think long and hard before scanning a QR code unless it's on a video screen. I should probably put that, unless it's on a video screen. Still should be careful if you don't trust the person who's putting up the thing on the video screen. But if you see a QR code on a poster, look long and hard and make sure it's not a sticker. Because it might not be that the person who printed that poster included that QR code. Somebody else might have stuck something else on top of it. Or they might just have stuck a QR code in a bit of white space on a poster. I always see these QR codes like stuck on lampposts downtown and think, who would scan that? You have no idea where it goes. QR codes can do lots of different things. We think of them as generally being a link to information, a link to a website, but that's not all they do. A QR code can automatically join you to a Wi-Fi network. So somebody puts it on a post and they're sitting nearby with a compromised Wi-Fi network, they can immediately gain access to all your communications if you join that Wi-Fi network. And that could be as simple as scanning the code. Or it can take you to a malicious site, or it can add somebody into your contacts on your phone, which can have implications if you use things like Telegram or WhatsApp or Signal. So always think long and hard about whether or not a QR code is something you want to scan. And then generally, most phones will give you a preview of what it is before you do whatever it wants you to do. Look at it carefully and determine if it's something you actually want to go to, especially if it's a shortened URL. And if you're making QR codes, I would always recommend to make a QR code using the actual URL to make people's life easier, rather than a tiny URL. I know we were just talking about this, but rather than a tiny URL or something else that they can't, it hides the actual link. So if I'm expecting to go to a UBC website and I preview my QR code scan and it's ubc.ca and then stuff, I feel a lot better about going ahead and continuing with that link. Did anybody scan the QR code? No? Yes? Okay. Well, it's fun if you do. Anyway, we'll stop here. Are there any other questions that anybody wants to ask about anything cybersecurity related, just real quick? And we'll stick around after as well for a bit. Okay.
You can also arg.ubc.ca. You can also come send us your question, come talk to us. We're there all the time.
Yeah. It's a Rickroll. That's all it is. It's pretty harmless. Okay. One of the people on the cybersecurity team for UBC, Matthew Ellis, who's one of our main incident responders, he actually has a QR code stuck on the back of his backpack on Velcro that if somebody scans it, takes them to a page explaining why they really shouldn't do that. And I see him walking around with it every now and then downtown. It cracks me up. Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot safer on a video presentation because you know that the people presenting are the ones who put the QR code there. But if it's a physical QR code on a poster and it's not behind glass or something, I pretty much just don't.
Table at a restaurant.
Yeah, this is our menu.
Paper menu.
Yeah. Okay, I will jump all the way to the end. As you can see, there's a few slides. Okay, and I will pass it back to Rachel.
Yeah, so I just noticed there's a lot of cybersecurity issue with this slide, but I hope you guys trust us enough to scan the QR code or enter the short URL to complete the survey.
No.
And just a plug
Real
for
QR
tomorrow's
code.
session. You probably heard the term Globus several times in this presentation. So we are having an introduction to Globus session tomorrow morning if you're interested in. I'm just going to give people a couple minutes to complete the survey, but this is the end of the session, right? But Luke and Scott will stick around for a couple more minutes to answer any questions that you may have. Yeah, so thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Hope you enjoyed the session, and we look forward to seeing you on the next 2 days of summer school. Thank you.
Great.